So I'll just start by talking a little bit about Tower Hamlets. I don't want to assume that any of you know what Tower Hamlets is, where it is, what it's like. So Tower Hamlets is a very small borough. It's 7 square miles. It's typically it's the East End of London, essentially. It's the borough that neighbours the City of London. It's just a short distance from where we are today. It's a really exciting borough. It's really diverse. There's a lot going on. You've got the markets of Spitalfields, Brick Lane. You've got obviously the thriving financial centre at Canary Wharf. It's an area that's seen a lot of regeneration over the last few years, and it's an area that's brought people from all over the world to call Tower Hamlets their home. But for all that there is to be said about Tower Hamlets and all the good that is in Tower Hamlets, it does remain one of the most deprived boroughs in the UK. In Tower Hamlets, 1 in 5 households has a combined household income of less than £15,000 per year. It has unemployment rates that sit above the national and London unemployment rates, and it has the highest level of child poverty in the whole of the UK. In Tower Hamlets, 49% of children grew up in houses affected by poverty. So that's almost 1 in 2 children in the borough of Tower Hamlets grow up in households affected by poverty. So what does that mean? What does it mean to grow up in a house where income is very low, or perhaps you are classed as being affected by poverty? Well, it means many things. It means that day to day, month to month, it's a struggle to get by, it's a struggle to make ends meet and to put food on the table. But it also means that it's very difficult to cope with unexpected things that happen in life. When an unexpected cost comes along, if you've got savings or you've got financial support from family or friends, then you can cope with an unexpected cost or a crisis. If you don't have these things, if you don't have an income that allows you to save, then an unexpected event in life can very easily plunge you into a crisis that's disproportionate, perhaps, to the thing that happened in the first place. And this is what we see day in, day out, week in, week out at the Tower Hamlets Foodbank. Is people who have experienced things in life that to an unfortunate extent are part of life, bereavement, illness, mental health crisis, family breakdown, domestic violence, but the impact of those things without any wiggle room, without any contingency, without any financial buffer, is that a family is very easily plunged into crisis. So at the Food Bank we try very hard to make sure that the Food Bank is a welcoming space, it's a non-judgmental space, it's a space to come and say, something has gone wrong and I need help, and where you can come and say that without feeling ashamed. And I'm really proud of our staff and volunteers and supporters who make that happen. But the reality is that the vast majority of people who come through our doors don't want to be that. And I hope that's not because we don't give them a good welcome, it's because there remains a huge sense of shame about going to strangers and asking for food to feed your family. And so what we do at the Tower Hamlets Foodbank is we have quite a holistic approach to food bank, and we very much focus on the underlying cause of crisis. Why is it that someone's coming to our doors, and what can we do to get them a solution to that as quickly as possible? So we work in partnership with over 200 agencies just in the borough of Tower Hamlets to get someone access to the support and advice that they need for their crisis as quickly as possible. So that might be advice around welfare benefits, it might be advice around debt, it might be advice around housing, it might be mental health support, parenting support, or any number of other types of support and advice that someone might need to move from being in a food bank crisis to leading what we would call a stable and sustainable life. And as I said, I'm really proud that we do that work. Our volunteers are amazing, our supporters right across the community, whether it's churches like this one or community organisations or individuals, they all contribute to a service that really makes a difference in real people's lives. And I think that that's something that we should celebrate, and the values and the attitudes and behaviours that we see in food banks are to be celebrated. They do show the best of our society. But as you've probably seen, the title of this talk is Food Banks, Why We Shouldn't Need Them. So why is it that food banks, although within them as much to be celebrated, do occupy this kind of contentious space in our society? And we haven't got long today, so I'm just going to talk about 2 reasons that I think, or 2 ways or areas where we probably shouldn't need the food bank, but where they are being increasingly used to tackle these types of problems. So I'm just going to cover 2 of those today. So the first one is that increasing numbers of people are accessing food banks for an increasing length of time because of flaws in the social security system. Right across the UK, and it's been reflected here in Tower Hamlets, the single biggest reason that's driving people to need the food bank, and particularly for a continued period of time, is that they're unable to access welfare benefits as quickly as they need to. And let me be clear, we're not referring to people who are accessing welfare benefits and can't manage them or are finding it difficult to budget. I'm referring to people who have no income at all and are not able to access social security payments. So what do we see? What does that mean? What's going wrong? We see a lot of delay, a lot of administrative error, and a lot of, frankly, avoidable things happening that mean that vulnerable people go without the support they need in a time of crisis. So imagine that you're a mother or indeed a father who's fled domestic violence, who's gone in the night with the kids, has arrived in a new borough like Tower Hamlets, maybe from somewhere up north or somewhere in the Midlands, is here in a refuge, has no access to any financial support for either yourself or your children. And so very quickly, you need to access some kind of emergency support. And what we'd expect is that is where the welfare system would step in to support a family in this kind of crisis. But what we see frequently is families like this can wait 6, 8 weeks, 2 months, 3 months, while their claims are being processed. And I'm sure all of you have dealt with many kind of frustrating departments or organisations or companies in your life. Imagine if trying to negotiate or navigate a system was your means to securing a basic income. So every time you called somewhere, you were told to call back. Or every time you called and said that you'd submitted a document, you were told the document had been lost and you needed to send it again. Or you were told the document had been logged, that it would be a month before they could decide what to do about the document you'd sent. Imagine if the outcome of that was whether or not you could feed your children that night. Can you imagine how frustrating that would be, but also how impossibly difficult that is for families who are relying on those payments to provide food for themselves and their children? Or perhaps you're an individual who's become too unwell to work, and perhaps the income that you were receiving was too low for you to save. And yet when you've tried to claim a welfare payment that would help you to support yourself while you're sick, again you call up and are told that your claim's being processed in this office, and now it's in this office, and now you've sent a medical certificate, and now it's been lost, and now you've sent it again, and 2 months later you're still waiting. We came across a GP who, as standard, issued 2 medical certificates as standard because she was so sure that the first one would be lost. And that pretty much reflects what we see. And I understand that systems are complicated, and it's complicated to administer them. But we see people day in, day out, week in, week out, who need basic payments to be able to survive, and yet they're not receiving them. And so we understand and we agree that food banks should step in as that first point of emergency, first port of call in an emergency. No system can be immediately responsive to the kind of crises that might befall any of us in life. But I think we'd all reasonably expect that after 2 or 3 weeks or so, that is where the welfare system would kick in to help people who are lost their employment, or have become too sick to work, or have children to support on an unexpectedly low income. That's what we'd expect the welfare system to do. And yet time and time again, because of quite simple, avoidable errors, we see people coming to the food bank instead for support. So I celebrate all that we do at the food bank in terms of how we can provide that caring, compassionate environment. But what I don't celebrate is where we become a 2-3 month solution where we shouldn't be. And so we as an organisation, together with some of our campaign partners, are calling on the government to look again at some of quite simple policies and procedures around welfare that will ensure that basic payments got to people a lot quicker and a lot more effectively than they do now. So that's my first point, that people come to the food bank too often because of flaws in the social security system. And my second point is that more people are using the food bank, and again for longer, because the work that they can access is too low paid or too insecure. Particularly we seek to support the most basic of lifestyles in London. So in Tower Hamlets, 81% of the jobs available exist in Canary Wharf or in the City of London, technically Tower Hamlets, but 81% of near jobs in Tower Hamlets exist in the Canary Wharf or in the City of London. 15% of those jobs are fulfilled by local people. Now, of course, you know, Tower Hamlets economy and the national economy is really grateful for everyone who comes from other parts of the country to fulfil those roles. But what it means for a lot of local people is that the only work they can access is very low paid and very insecure work. So if you work, say, 35 hours a week doing a minimum wage job, say a cleaning job, your income would be about £12,000 a year before tax. Now, we all know the price of rented accommodation in London, and we all know that £12,000 a year probably wouldn't even cover somewhere for you to live. And so we see people doing 2 or 3 jobs a week, 2 or 3 jobs a day, just trying to keep their heads above the water, trying to support themselves and their families in London. And that's the best case scenario, really, that you find enough work to do 2 or 3 minimum wage jobs to keep your head above the water. But we see that a lot of work that's available to people, particularly low-paid work, is very insecure. 0 hours contracts, for anyone who's not familiar with these, this essentially means that you are contractually obliged to do 0 hours a week, which sounds great, apart from if you need more than 0 hours a week to pay your rent or to support your family. We recently saw a young man who'd done a carpentry apprenticeship. He was really pleased that he'd got on, he'd done his course, he'd got his carpentry qualification, he got himself a tenancy for a room in a shared house, and he got himself a job as a carpenter. But it was a 0 hours contract. So one week he got 35 hours work, the next week he got 10, the next week he got 0. But of course his rent doesn't fluctuate in the same way as the hours of his carpentry job. So how does he pay his rent, which is fixed, when his income is variable? And we see a lot of people who are signed on to 0 hours contracts and who are not allowed to take work with other organisations. This kind of work is not viable. It's not a viable way to live, and particularly not when living costs in London are so high. And so we see people coming to the food bank because they can't rely on their income, their earned income, to provide food for themselves and their family. So again, I don't feel that the role of the food bank is to supplement low-paid or insecure work. We see many people who want to work, who are able to work, who can work and should work, and yet the work that they do doesn't pay them what they need to live in London. And so we, as an organisation, we would advocate the London living wage, and we would really encourage employers to reconsider 0 hours contracts, particularly those that make it impossible for people to work elsewhere. So just as a way of concluding, as I said, the type of this talk is food banks. Do we need them, or should we need them, or shall we get rid of them, or something along those lines? My answer would be yes and no. I think there's a lot to celebrate in food banks. I think the volunteer hours, the donations of food, the support and genuine care and compassion for people in crisis that's been shown by churches, but also by voluntary organisations, or just by the individuals at large. We should really celebrate that. And I'd never want to do away with that. And I think that is the best of our society, when we see so much genuine care and compassion being shown to our neighbours. And arguably some of that can never be provided by the state or any type of institution, because it's one-to-one, it's relational, it's care, it's compassion, and that, at the moment of crisis, is what makes a real difference. Well, what I would say is we need to be careful about what the scope of the food bank is, or what it's becoming. As I said, the role for food bank is for the point of crisis, is to sit there with someone in that moment and to say, we're going to get you the help. But the help being available and being reliable is what we need as the next step. And so I'd say that I'm proud of the values of care, of justice, of compassion that we see inside the food bank and everyone who supports the food bank. But what I'd like to see is those same values extending beyond the food bank into the other key actors in the support for vulnerable people, into the welfare system, and into the employment opportunities that we offer, particularly those that are at the lower end of the income spectrum. That until we embed values of justice and of care and of kindness in those systems, then we won't have a robust way to support the most vulnerable people in our society.